Today's daf is daf Chafov, and what we got up to yesterday, when we were mashlim the shir, was up to the second of the wide line. It starts with the word kulu, and the Gemara had established that there are certain occasions on which you're obligated in kriya, other than, in addition to, the loss of the 7 close relatives. And one of those occasions is called Shmuos Ros. So the Gemara says, Umi Karinan Ashmuos Haros. Is it really true that for Shmuel Ra, we're obligated in Kriya? Amru Lei L'Shmuel. Shmuel heard the news, terrible news, that Katal Shvar Malka, apparently one of the Persian kings, killed Tresar Alfa Yudai. He was responsible for the death of 12,000 Jews in a place called Mezigas Kesar. Below Korah, and Shmuel did not cut his garments. And certainly that would constitute a Shmuel Ra, would it not? In the death of 12,000 Jews. And yet Shmuel did not cut Kriya. So how can you tell me that we're obligated in Kriya on a Shmuel Ra? And the Gemara answers, Lo Amru Ela Barov Tzibur. So in the great battle in which Shaul HaMelech and his sons were killed, that was a case of Rov Tzibur. Probably Rov Tzibur, it means that in Shaul's final battle, the number of Jews that were killed was equal to more than half of the members of a single shevet. So that's called Rov Tzibur, because the shevet represents the Tzibur. And in that sense, you have Rov Tzibur if most of the members of a single tribe were killed. But in the case of the 12,000 who were killed by Shvar Malka, that was not a majority of a shevet. Therefore, there was no kriya, and it doesn't constitute a Shmuel Ra. Then the Gemara goes on the side and says, Umi katal Shvar Malka Yudai. Is it true that Shvar Malka actually killed Jews? Shvar Malka Shmuel, when Shmuel Malka Shvar Malka was boasting, so to speak, to the Navi, he says, Tasili, I deserve a reward. The Lokatli Yehudi V'olam. I never killed a single Jew in my life. The Gemara now is going to interpret that when Shvar Malka told Shmuel he never killed a Jew, what he meant is he never killed an innocent Jew. But Hassam, in the 12,000 Jews that Shvar Malka killed in battle, Inu Garmei L'Nafshai, the Jews rebelled against King Shapur and brought upon themselves their death. The Omer Rabbi Ami, the statement of Rabbi Ami, L'kol Yisere de Mezigas Kasra. The noise of the harp of Mezigas Kasra. In other words, the Jews decided that they would rebel against the king, and they played these musical instruments as part of the celebration commemorating their rebellion, their revolution. And Pakashur de Luktia, the sounds or the notes of the harp was a noise that created a crack in the wall of Lutkia. But in any event, this was the great rebellion that was quelched by King Shapur, in which 12,000 Jews were killed. But they were, in a sense, guilty, so to speak, for bringing upon themselves. This is a general question about rebellion. When are the Jews allowed to rebel according to Jewish hashkaf, when they're not? So we're up to Birchas Hashem Minolan, another case which the Brisa listed, which is a situation that generates a chiv kriya, is called Birchas Hashem. But that's a euphemism for the word klol. Bracha really means a klol. But if somebody heard a Birchas Hashem, then he's chayiv in kriya. And the question is, Minolan, how do we derive such a halacha, such a requirement? And now we quote a pasuk in Malachim. And it says, Vayavo Eliakim ben Chilkia Asher Labayis, B'Shevna Asofer, B'Yoach ben Osaf Amazkir, El Chizkio Krue B'Godin. There's a whole list of people, including Eliakim. And Eliakim, it says here, was Al Abayis. Al Abayis means he was in charge of the palace. It was Shevna, who was described. It was Yoach, the son of Asa, who was in charge of recording all the kingly decisions, etc. And all the above went to Chizkiyo, and they were wearing begadim kruim. So they had already done kriya. And why did they do kriya? Because, as recorded earlier in that same section in Perek Yud Ches of Malachim Beis, there was blasphemy. Therefore, they were chayiv in kriya. So they showed up to Chizkiyahu HaMelech wearing begadim kruim. The Brisa teaches it's not enough that if you heard the blasphemy, but even you heard it from someone who transmitted it to you. So you didn't hear it directly, you still chayiv in kriya. However, Eidim einom chayavim l'kro. The Eidim, when they heard the blasphemy, they rendered their garments. Now they're testifying and mentioning what they heard, but they don't have to do a second kriya. It's enough and sufficient that they cut kriya at the time they actually heard the Birchas Hashem. The Gemara asks the following question. I don't understand the logic of the Bryce. Even if they were Korea when they heard originally the Birchas Hashem, but now they're hearing it a second time. Why shouldn't the second blasphemy generate a chiyuv kriya? And the Gemara says, "Lo sakadai." Not entertain such an idea that they're hearing a second kriya and therefore they have to cut their garments. The chsiv, because in that same parsha that we learned earlier, with regard to Yaakov ben Chilkiah and Shivna and Yoav, who all rendered their garments, it says that when they repeated to Chizkiah the words of blasphemy, then Chizkiah Melech, he was the one who ripped his garment. And the implication is the Haim, but they who were repeating what they had heard, lo karu, because they had already cut kriya on these words. They were just repeating them in order to transmit them to the Melech. So for the Melech, it was the first time he heard these words of blasphemy. He was obligated to kriya. Now the Brisa paskins that lo misachim, that in all these cases of kriya, there is no permission to repair the garment after you rip it. We know. How do we know this? And the Gemara answers, Asya kriya kriya. We have a gzera shava of kriya kriya. In other words, by Eliakim, Shevna, and Yoach, when they came to Chizkiyahu, it says krue begadim. And with regard to Elisha Navi, when he saw Eliyahu go up to the chariot, up to Shamayim, it says, Vayikraim lishnayim kroim. So we have the word kriya twice. Now, with regard to Elisha, we already derived from the extra pasuk that it says, lishnayim, that he tore them into two pieces, that they could not be repaired. And now, by equation, the same halacha applies to all the cases of kriya that are mentioned here in the Brisa, like the death of the leader of the generation, etc., etc. There's no permission to repair the kriya. Now, on the list in the price of cases in which you chayv and kriya Sefer Torah nitzraf. If you see the burning of a Sefer Torah, minolan, how do we know this? What's the source from which we derive that if you witness the burning of a Sefer Torah, you're chayav and kriya? And the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Yirmiyahu now. Now, there's a whole story here about Yirmiyahu and Baruch ben Neriah. Yirmiyahu Navi, of course, was the Navi that foretold the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and all the tragedies that would come in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. Baruch ben Neriah was the sofer, he was the scribe, and he recorded the entire story, this prophecy of the calamities that would befall the nation, in a scroll. Now, this scroll was the original version of Eicha. Eicha, of course, was authored by Yirmiyahu Navi, but who actually committed the words of Yirmiyahu and his prophecies to writing? It was none other than Baruch ben Neriah. And these are what consists the first, second, and fourth chapters of Eicha. Later on, Yirmiyahu Navi added the third and fifth chapter. Eicha was read from a scroll publicly at the time before the Churban Abayis, in the hope that this would be like a musar that would inspire the people to repent and avert the destruction of the Mikdash. And it did have a great impact on those who heard them. But they read it before the Melech Yoyakim. He was a big Russia. And he took the scroll of Eicha that was written by Baruch ben Neriah, and he burned it in the fire. And as a result, they cut Kriya. Kasav Yirmiyah Sefer Kinos. Amalu Mak Sivbe. What does it say in Kinos? Eicha Yashva Badad. The Jewish nation sits alone. Amalahu. So Yehoiakim is not impressed. I know Malka. I don't care if the people have to sit alone. I'm the king. That's all that counts. I'm in power. Let the Jews go into exile. I don't care. He was unfazed. Amrule. What else does it say in the book of Eicha? Bachosiv kebalayla. She weeps bitterly in the night. I know Malka. I'm the king. I couldn't care less. Golsa Yudavianya Meoni. The Jewish people went into exile. Suffering. Couldn't care less. I know Malka. I'm the king. This is Yoyakim. Tarchitzin Avilos. I know Malka. Hoyu Tsorim L'Rosh. Now something changed. Hoyu Tzorel L'Rosh. Her adversaries have become her master. And that means that the king is going to lose his throne. Amar lahu man amara, who said this? In other words, is Yirmiyahu saying this in the name of the Almighty? Ki Hashem hoga arov sha'el. They answered that Hashem has spoken of her, meaning of Knesset Yisrael, because of her transgressions. Miyad, immediately, when he heard this prophecy, that he would lose his throne, Kadar kol azkar sheba. He took his scissors and he cut out all the names of God that were in this scroll, usrafan ba'esh, and he burnt in the fire. Ahainu desiv, and in the following pasuk, describing the burning of the scroll, it says, "V'lo pochadu v'lo karo es bigdeim," that the king himself was not afraid. He wasn't impressed by the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, and neither him nor any of his entourage would rip their garments. Bichlal, we imply, since this is a critique of El Yokim Russia, that the Bola Mikri, that there would have been a chiyuv to cut kriya upon the burning of a Torah scroll or any sefer of Tanakh, of the Kisvei HaKodesh. Now, how do we know that you're not allowed to repair that kriya after the sreifa of the Sefer Torah? This is based, according to Tosar Rosh, on a halacha. Halacha is that if you lose a Rebbe who taught you Torah, you're not allowed to repair it. How much more so, the burning of the Torah itself cannot be mended. The kriya cannot be mended. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye. Amar mishum shmuas haros. How do you know that the implication of this pasuk is that they would have to do kriya on the burning of the Sefer Torah? Maybe they were chayav kriya for a different reason entirely, because they heard about the impending destruction and the exile. And that's a shmua ra. Amar lei. So Abai responded to Rav Papa, Shmuos rose by he shite to be havel. Shmuos rose is only when you hear about something that took place, a tragedy, a calamity. But here, it's simply a nevuah predicting the future. That's not Shmuos ra. And therefore, by process of elimination, the only reason and cause for the kriya would have been the burning of the sefer. Om Rabbi Chelbom Rav Huna, a roa sefer Torah shenikra. Now, the word shenikra here should be amended. It should say shenisra, as I state in the Rashash. So there's a mistake in our printed Gemaras. A roa sefer Torah shenisra, chayiv l'kro shtei kriyos. Echad al gvil v'echad al ksav. First on the parchment, which has kedusha, and secondly on the osios, the letters themselves, which obviously are the words of the Sefer. Shenemar, and the Gemara is now going to derive this conclusion from the same parsha that we learned earlier. It says, Achrei srof hamelches hamegillah v'esadvarim. So I guess if I read the Gemara correctly, it says here, Es HaMegillah Ves HaDvarim. The Megillah represents the scroll itself, and that Sreifa generates Kriya. And then it says Es HaDvarim, the words, meaning the letters themselves. And that generates a Chiyuv Kriya. You know, the Darshanim have a lot to say about this Gemara, because the Osios represent the Torah, and the Talmidei Chachamim who teach the Torah. The parchment represents the rank and file Jew on which the Torah is inscribed. Rabbi Abba, Rav Huna Bar Chia V'Yasvei, they were sitting and learning at the feet of Rebbe. Come, Rebbe Abba. Rebbe Abba rose. Boy Lafnui had to go to the washroom. Shakli L'Totovsei, he took off his tefillin shel Rosh. Achte means laniach, abe saja, on a bed or a couch. Asoi bas ne'ima, so an animal, which is called a bas ne'ima. In English, it's called an ostrich. Boy lemivle, an ostrich will eat anything. Omar, hashta ichayvina li shtei kriyos. If this would occur, meaning if we hadn't gotten the tefillin before they were swallowed by the ostrich, then I would be chayav in two kriyos, one for the scroll and one for the osios. Amalei, so Rav Huna said to him, Mina lach ha, how do you know a double kriya? But the day I had an incident, I guess, where the tefillin were destroyed. The asoy coming to Rav Nasma. I came in front of Rav Nasma. But having Biadi didn't know. Asoy coming to Rav Yehuda. I went to Rav Yehuda. The Amali Hachi Amar Shmulo Amru Ela Bizroa Ube Maisa Shahaya. The only time you chayv in kriya on the destruction or the streifa of the Sefer Torah or tefillin is only if it was done as an anti-Semitic act of shmad. Like, for example, Yoakim, who destroyed Megillas Eicha. So when you see in front of you the enemies, the adversaries of the Jewish people destroying a Sefer Torah tefillin, then you're chayav in kriya because you're powerless. You can't stop them. But if something happens accidentally, the tefillin fell and it got ruined or something like that, in such a case, you're not chayav in kriya. And that was the psak of Shmuel. Therefore, the Gemara objects to Rabbi Abba, who claimed that if the ostrich had ate up the tefillin, he would have been chayiv in 2 kriyas. Not only in 1 kriya, but in 2 kriyas. Well, he's not chayiv in kriya at all because that's accidental. That's not an act of shmad. Ora Yehuda Minolan. We go back to the brisa that says that you're chayiv in kriya when you see the destroyed cities of Yehuda. How do we know this? And we're going to base it on a pasuk in Yirmiyahu Hanavi. It says, "Vayavo Anoshim Mishchem Mishilo Mishomron." The men came from these 3 places, and again, keep in mind that Shiloh is where the Mishkan stood for many centuries. Shmonim Ish, there were 80 men. Begulachei Zakan, they were clean shaven. Kruei Begadim, but they were wearing rent garments. Misgodim, that's agudos, when you rip into your skin, you cut into your skin. Umincha ulavona biyadam lahavi beis Hashem. They didn't know that the Mikdash was destroyed. They were unaware of the fact that the Mikdash was destroyed. They thought they were going to bring a carbon in the Beis Hamikdash. Why did they rip their garments? Because they saw the destroyed cities of Yehuda. They did not see the destruction of Yerushalayim. Now, Rashi points out here that these cities of Shiloh and Shechem and Shomer are not in Yehuda. So we can't be talking about ripping their garments because they saw these cities. We're saying that they ripped their garments because of the destroyed cities of Yehuda. These are not cities in Yehuda. So it must mean that they came from these areas, but when they arrived in a place called Mitzpeh, where you could have a high point to a lookout place, that's where they beheld the destroyed cities of Yehuda, and that's when they rent their garments, and that's why the pasuk says, Ukrue Begadim. Amar Rabbi Chelba Rabbi Ula Bira, that's what his name was. Amar Rabbi Lazar. Aroa or Yehuda B'Korbanah. Now there are going to be 3 levels here. There's Ara Yehuda destroyed, there's Yerushalayim, and there's Beis HaMikdash. And in each case, he should recite a pasuk. In the case of Ara Yehuda, he recites the pasuk, Are Kadshecha Hayu Midbar. And then he does Kriya. Your holy cities have become a wilderness. Pasuk in Yeshayahu, I know. All the pasukim here are from Yeshayahu. Yerushalayim, he sees Yerushalayim b'churbanah. Omer Tzion Midbar Hoysa Yerushalayim Shmama. Tzion became a wilderness. Yerushalayim became a wasteland. B'korea, and he rips his garment. Beis HaMikdash b'churbanah. He sees the site of the Mikdash destroyed. Omer should declare, Beis Kod Sheinu B'Sifar Teinu Asher Hillel Luchavu Seinu Hoya L'Sreifas Eish B'Chol Machmadeinu Hoya L'Churva. The Mikdash of our holiness and our splendor, where our forefathers praised you, has become a fiery conflagration, and all that we desired has become a ruin. V'Korea. And he renders his garment. Now the Gemara is going to address the following question. Normally, when you're on your way to the Mikdash and you pass through Yerushalayim, we just finished saying that when you see Yerushalayim b'churbano, you're chayiv in Kriya. When you see the Mikdash b'churbano, you're chayiv in Kriya. What happens if he goes from Yerushalayim to the Mikdash? So the answer is Korei al Mikdash u'mosif al Yerushalayim. Mosif means after the Kriya reaches a certain point, let's say he was Korea Tefach on Mikdash, now he adds another 3 etzvos, so we'll see what it is, when he beholds the ruins of Yerushalayim. For a minute, we have a price that says the exact opposite. Echad hashomeh v'echad haroeh. Whether he hears about the destruction of the Mikdash or he sees it in ruins, he's chayiv in Kriya. But kevan she'igil itself in Korei should not immediately do the Kriya, but rather he should climb up to a place called Sofim, a lookout place, and that's where he should do Kriya. But Sofim, a village near Yerushalayim, is a place from which one can see the Mikdash site. Kevan she'igil it's Sofim Korea, v'Korea al Mikdash b'fnei atzma v'Yerushalayim b'fnei atzma. The Brisa says that you need 2 separate kriyos. It's not that when you rip it on one kriya, now for the second kriya you just extend it. That's not enough. You need 2 separate kriyos. Al Mikdash b'fnei atzma, al Yerushalayim b'fnei atzma. So Gemara says, no problem, I can reconcile. Lo kasha, chad apaga b'Mikdash b'reisha, now, how can you possibly get to the Mikdash before you get to Arei Yerushalayim? The answer is they carried him in a carriage, an agala, without the windows were closed, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the Mikdash b'churbano. In such a case, he does kriya on both Yerushalayim. I'm sorry, 1 second. The Poga, the Mikdash Bereisha, right? So they took him in a carriage, and he cuts kriya on the Mikdash. Oh, and then they took him from the Mikdash into Yerushalayim, and he saw Yerushalayim b'churbana. Now he extends the kriya that he did on the Mikdash. But other Pagam Yerushalayim b'reisha, if he wasn't taken in a carriage, and the first thing he saw was Yerushalayim, he cuts kriya on Yerushalayim, and then when he gets to the Makom of Mikdash, it's chayiv in a separate, independent kriya. In other words, it's a matter of going from the top to the bottom, so to speak. From the more intense Avelis to the lesser Avelis. If you're going from the intense Avelis of a Kriya on Mikdash down to the Kriya on Yerushalayim, then all you have to do is extend it. But if you're going upwards from a less level of Avelis to a higher level of Avelis, from Yerushalayim to Mikdash, then you need a second Kriya for the Mikdash. Even though we are not allowed to repair the Kriya, but we're allowed to do something called Lishololon. If you remember, we already discussed this. These are broad stitches. Ulamololon, you're allowed to fold them over. Ulaloktan, you're allowed to gather them together. Lasosan kimin sulamos, or stitch them like ladders. Avalola chosam, but you're not allowed to mend them and repair them. So in the notes there, he gives you a whole, shall I say, a lesson in sewing. Like, I'm not familiar with this. He says, what does it mean? Lemololon means to pull together the fabric on both sides of the kriya, fold the 2 pieces like a book, and stitch them together tightly or slightly. Again, we need a picture for this. I mean, you can get it online, but I don't have the time for it right now. Now we have another concept called a lopton, to gather all the fabric together and stitch it slightly. And finally, we have lasoson kimin sulamos, to place stitches in the fabric at wide intervals so that the stitches resemble the rungs of a ladder, which have spaces between them. Amar Rav Chisda.